I think the topic that we're going to discuss, opposing Islamophobia and the Prevent agenda, is a very timely topic, and it's a very pertinent one, I think, not just the Muslim communities, but every community across the UK. So when we talk about this topic, it's very important to understand what Islamophobia is. So in the news, in social media, we see instances of both men and women, visible and maybe not so visible Muslims, being attacked either verbally or physically. And we think that's what Islamophobia is. And while Islamophobia does obviously encompass hostility and hate crime, it encompasses far more than that. So it actually infiltrates every aspect of public life and creates barriers for Muslims and the communities to which they belong to. So it's an institutional problem. Now, when we want to understand and dissect what institutional Islamophobia is, I think it's very important that we link to and try to understand what institutional racism is. So we go back to Kwame Ture from the Black Panther Party, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, and Charles Hamilton. And in 1967, when talking about what institutional racism actually is, they described it as being something subtle, something less overt than individual racism, as we see. And as a result of this, it receives less, firstly, public condemnation, and secondly, I would argue, public attention than individual racism. So let's contextualize this with institutional Islamophobia. So we've spoken about how hate crime is one aspect of Islamophobia, but there's also economic exclusion, such as discrimination Muslims face in employment, the media narratives and moral panics, which disproportionately portray them in a negative light. And then we move on to the realm of policy, so security and counterterrorism. And this is where Prevent comes into play. So for those who may not necessarily know what Prevent is, it's part of the government's broader counterterrorism strategy called Contest. And the aim of Contest is to protect the public against acts of terrorism. And whilst this is an aim I'm sure all of us in society can get behind, the unfortunate reality is that Prevent, rather than fulfilling its aim, has actually, I would argue, mutated into a vehicle through which Muslims are securitized, ostracized, marginalized, and posited as the suspect community within the UK. Now, you might ask, why am I talking about Muslims when it comes to Prevent? The data speaks for itself. A British Muslim is 41 times more likely than a non-Muslim to be referred to Channel, which is the next stage up from Prevent, despite the fact Muslims make up around 5% of the population. So there's a gross overrepresentation of Muslims within Prevent and all of its mechanisms. Now, Prevent has several flaws, and I'm sure my respected co-panelists will explore these further, but I want to focus on just a few. So let's start off with how it operates. So it enforces a statutory duty on public bodies to have due regard for what is termed signs of potential radicalization. So that essentially means schools, universities, prisons, local authorities are placed under a duty to report those who they suspect may be vulnerable to radicalization. Now, for those of my colleagues in the education sphere, like the NUS, for example, who have done studies on this, they've noted how Prevent impacts on free speech. They've noted how it impacts on political engagement, because it creates a situation whereby Muslim students and activists will censor themselves out of fear of being referred. Now, you might ask, how does this operate in practice? So let's say someone asks a question about foreign policy or expresses a strong opinion on British foreign policy. Well, the lack of definitions, viable definitions for extremism and radicalization has led to a situation where this can be seen as a sign of being drawn to political violence. There are case studies where someone, for example, has criticized foreign policy or has started wearing the hijab or gone to Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, or has started taking more of an interest in certain news channels, which may be in the Arabic language. These have all been seen and documented as signs which could lead to them being engaged in political violence. It's a very unfortunate sort of effect of Prevent, that it criminalizes people for expressing these opinions or whatever. So we've got research by Warwick University, which actually looked at counterterrorism in the NHS, for example, and 70% of the respondents in that study were either likely or very likely to refer someone for possession of an Islamic or anarchist philosophy book. Now, this is an important point to make, because under the prevent training program, whilst it doesn't indicate this as a factor indicative of radicalization, what it shows is that prevent has engendered and fostered these views in society whereby Muslims are seen and held in a suspicious way. Now, while on its own this might seem as something not that serious, the reality is there's an over-representation of Muslims in a false way under prevent. So a lot of false positive referrals. Out of the 6,093 people referred to prevent in 2017 and 18, only 5% went on to receive channel support. And why this is damaging is that this sticks with them for the rest of their lives. A recent study by Dr. Hilary Ackhead found that colleges in Manchester were secretly agreeing to share data of people just referred to prevent. Okay, now this is something that sticks with them for the rest of their lives. Wherever they go, this data will be shared, and the fact that they've been referred will hold on to them, unfortunately. So yeah, ultimately, if we want to combat Islamophobia, we need to look at all of its forms and manifestations. So right now, we see the tip of the iceberg in terms of hate crimes and hostility, but there's so much more beneath the surface which we need to tackle and address.